good news. I think that English teachers are the new superheroes who can save the planet from its current crisis. We might not look like it, but I really do think we are. Now, we all know that writers have been doing their bit for eons. They've been keeping us entertained with cheerful little stories about catastrophic disasters. But have you ever noticed that in those stories, the earth and nature can be rather misunderstood or overlooked characters? Perhaps we see the earth as a thug in these stories, or the forces of nature are simply the backdrop for some character's mood or emotion. Perhaps we have a thunderstorm, which is the backdrop to Victor Frankenstein's Bad Day in the Lab. Well, English teachers, we do tend to focus on human concerns when we talk about things in the classroom. We do tend to focus on feminist issues, gender. We focus on class or race. But actually, there is another way of looking at stories. It's called eco-criticism. And this is about looking at how the earth is presented in the story. And I think that even though this has been around for 25 years, it's hardly ever used in our teaching. And I think that now is the time to introduce a new way of reading the story of the earth to young people, to help them notice when the planet is just being used as a backdrop for some person's story. Now, I think the way into this is for us to understand what stories are actually for. So I'm going to go back to the basics here, and I'm going to tell you that you're all a bunch of animals. Every single one of you. And like all animals, we want to feel secure. So we like to have food, love, shelter, warmth. And that's you pretty much euphoric. But unfortunately, our world doesn't work that way. We can have very unexpected calamities come along and shake out the ground from underneath our feet. So the way that humans cope with that is we work it out within community. We're pack animals. And we feel very anxious when we're not with our pack, which is why you all feel worried when you can't check your phone after an hour, or when your parents book a holiday in a hotel with no Wi-Fi for 2 weeks because they want you to read more books. Not that I've ever done that. But when we have stories, it's our way of working out how we can cope with disasters. It's our way of having community. And the first stories that you would have come across would have been traditional tales with a cautionary moral at its heart. And they would tie right into your primal fears. They would tie into fears of the dark or fears of things with big teeth. And at the end of that story, there was a very clear message. Don't go into the woods at night or a wolf will eat you up. And the same is true of natural disasters in stories. They are terrifying and they are unpredictable. And what we see in the story is that the fire, the brimstone, the tsunami, and the flood will only come if humans have given in to their immoral inclinations. Now, flood stories have been around for a long time, and they span from Africa to Alaska. The one that you're probably most familiar with is Noah's Ark in the West. And what these flood narratives all have in common is that they are what we call in the trade anthropocentric. They have human concerns at the heart of the story. So we look at Noah and his family, and we're rooting for them. They're our heroes in the story, and we want them to survive. Then we look at the sinners in the water, and for them we have a sense of despair. And the earth, well, the earth in that story is actually presented as a very crude tool of punishment by a deity. But these stories always seem to have a comforting end for the listener, a sugar-coated rainbow, and a promise that the flood will not come if you just all behave yourselves. However, these are pre-modern stories, and they predate a time when now science has taught us that we can predict when the flood will come, where it will come, why it will come. So what have our modern writers done with the flood narrative? Well, they've given us apocalyptic trauma again. And the problem with this is in the stories, all we have are our drowned worlds, we have our barren landscapes, we have poisoned food sources, and the real problem is that science wields the fatal blow in a very unpredictable way. And there is no happy ending. We tend to read the modern flood narratives in the same way our ancestors listened to the story of Noah, and we're rooting for our human heroes to win the day, but they won't. It's a depressing way to look at the modern story, but I want to talk to you a little bit about a modern writer who takes a different spin on this. Ballard wrote his 1962 novel, cheerfully entitled The Drowned World, long before scientists had actually worked out that sea levels were rising. He is like most science fiction writers, he manages to somehow be able to predict the future. He sets his modern Noah's Ark story after the flood. It's in a half-submerged London. The polar ice caps are melting because there are solar rays heating up the planet. And our heroes, our human heroes in this story, are actually seen at the end of the novel straggling off into the swamplands towards certain extinction. The creatures that are going to survive in this story are those that have learned to rapidly adapt and evolve to this new environment, to this heated up swampland prehistoric place. And those are the outsized amphibians and reptiles. We see enormous crocodiles, alligators, mosquitoes, and bats. They're the ones who are going to inherit a new paradise at the end of the story. And as for our human characters, well, I'm afraid it's a drowned world. Now, that one is a depressing read, but I would still highly recommend it to you. It was only a couple of years ago that I began to realise what Ballard was getting at. I was in Queensland and I met this 5-metre crocodile called Eileen. And Eileen, she had an interesting backstory. I was out on a swamp with a guide, and he told me that as she was leaping for chicken, because they encourage the crocs to leap up out of the water so the tourists can admire their grand stature. As she leapt up, another crocodile leapt up at the same time and bit her front paw off, or leg, whatever you call it, ripped it off entirely. And instead of bleeding out and dying on the spot, as I would surely have done, crocodiles have their own superpower. They are able to coagulate. She didn't bleed out. After a couple of hours, she was back in the fray, leaping for chicken once again, completely healed. And the guide said something that really struck me. He said, crocodiles have been around for millions and millions of years. They're very, very tough. And after we've gone, crocodiles are going to be here for millions and millions of years to come. And as I watched Eileen sort of slicing through the swamp away from me, I realized that Ballard was a writer who knew long before the rest of us that humans are just a marginal episode in the Earth's story. Now, that's quite a seismic shift in point of view for us to take. Stories are very powerful that way. They can make you change the way that you feel about yourself, society, and the world in which we live, a world which we have long since become accustomed to see as at our own disposal. I think the easiest way to put this is to ask you to imagine a story that you know, or a film that you've watched, where at the end of that story or film, you've actually changed your mind about a people group or a story in history where previously you might have had maybe quite a prejudiced view of it. And that's why books have been piled high and burned before now, because they are game changers. So with a recent realization of just how much we have neglected the earth and perhaps maligned and perhaps marginalized our planet, this new theory of eco-criticism has emerged. And the whole point is to present the earth as a hero in the story that you root for, the one that you want to survive at the end of the story. And that's quite a challenge for us, because in the 21st century, we have these apocalyptic stories that are tragic. They end very badly for the planet. And not only does the apocalypse come, but it comes because of human greed or mistakes on our part. And there is no comfort in those stories for the reader. And there is actually no stemming of our fear. In fact, they provoke fear in the reader. But fear isn't going to help to save our planet from its current crisis. And if we keep looking for an end to the story where the humans are the victors, the humans survive, then they won't, by the way, then we're just going to be disappointed. I think that the way forward is to set aside our inherent despair within the text, to stop feeling frightened for ourselves when we pick up a book or read a newspaper article, and start feeling sorry for the earth. I'm going to ask you all to become eco-critical readers, to become people who, when you look at a text, you wonder where the planet will end up at the end of the story. You perhaps ask yourself questions about the wilderness, the wildness, or the biosphere. And in that way, I think that it will provoke a powerful empathy for the planet and nature and Earth. They will be the heroes that we're rooting for, that we want to win. Because the other way, all that lies there is a paralysis. We get paralyzed by our fear, or we go into denial. So I think young people, and I think teachers in the classroom, we need to be talking about this more. And in this way, perhaps we'll begin to realize that we can, as people, have a more equal relationship with the planet. That we can look for ways in which the earth and humanity have a shared interest. And perhaps one day, we will no longer be in any need to fear the future or the flood. And maybe the earth just might have its happily ever after. Until, of course, the sun begins to swell up, but that's a different story for another rainy day.